What if we tell you that the colonization of Africa has not yet ended and has, in fact, worsened? In the past, the West colonized West Africa without concealing their actions. However, the situation has become even more perilous now, as colonization is occurring under the guise of partnerships.
We give them aid. Aid for what? Actually, we give them aid to keep repressive regimes in power.
But why can't Africa recognize it? Perhaps it can, but what if its hands are tied, preventing it from stopping it? Does this have something to do with Africa's corrupt leadership? These and many other questions will be addressed in today's video. So, let's get started. Starting with, what is the main concern regarding Western influence in Africa, and how does it relate to the legacy of colonialism? The primary concern surrounding Western influence in Africa centers on the persistence of neo-colonial practices, a phenomenon tied to the historical legacy of colonialism. Despite the hard-fought independence of African nations, the legacy of colonialism continues to cast a shadow, raising concerns about partnerships that mask strategic interventions beneath the impression of cooperation. The main worry is that these seemingly cooperative arrangements may conceal more insidious realities, reflecting a subtle continuation of historical power imbalances between Africa and the Western world. The concern about Western influence is deeply rooted in the historical context of African colonialism. But how does the West colonize Africa today? It all starts with economic relations. Economic relationships and trade agreements mostly favor Western interests, perpetuating economic dependencies. Unequal trade deals, resource extraction, and financial aid with strings attached can lead to economic imbalances that disadvantage African nations. Western powers influence African politics through diplomatic leverage, conditional aid, and strategic alliances. This can impact policy decisions and political priorities, aligning them more closely with external interests rather than the autonomous needs of African nations. Large Western corporations, often with ties to former colonial powers, also engage in exploitative business practices, taking advantage of weak regulatory environments. This can lead to environmental degradation, labor exploitation, and economic disparities within African countries. Africa's indebtedness to international financial institutions, often influenced by Western powers, can create a form of economic dependency. Debt conditions force African nations to implement policies that align with the interests of creditors. The cultural influence of the West, propagated through media, technology, and education, also shapes perceptions and values in African society. This influence contributes to cultural dominance that reinforces Western ideals and perspectives. Do African leaders play a role in letting the West colonize them and use them for their benefit? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Corruption within African leadership contributes to challenges faced by the continent, including issues related to economic development, governance, and the potential exploitation by external actors. Corruption exists in various parts of the world, not limited to Africa, and it can pose significant obstacles to development. In Africa, corruption manifests in mismanagement of public funds, embezzlement, bribery, and other unethical practices within government institutions. These issues can damage economic growth, erode public trust, and hinder the effective implementation of development initiatives. In the context of neo-colonialism or external influence, corrupt practices within African leadership can potentially be exploited by external actors seeking to further their interests. The manipulation of corrupt systems leads to unequal trade agreements, resource exploitation, and other forms of economic subjugation. How does labeling exploitation as a partnership give West leverage? In contemporary partnerships between African nations and Western powers, the narrative of cooperation and development has replaced exploitation. The shift from direct colonial rule ushered in a discourse emphasizing collaboration and mutual development. This change is a powerful tool for Western powers, allowing them to frame their involvement as benevolent partnerships rather than interventions driven by strategic interests. The narrative of cooperation provides a veil of legitimacy, enabling Western powers to maintain influence in the region while ostensibly supporting the autonomy of African nations. By presenting their engagement as a shared pursuit of development, these powers can avoid the negative connotations associated with historical exploitation. The language of cooperation and mutual progress becomes a facade that conceals the underlying power dynamics, creating a complex terrain for African nations to navigate. They seek genuine collaboration without compromising their sovereignty. What are the hidden realities behind the facade of partnership? Behind the facade of partnership, hidden realities often emerge, revealing that the narrative of cooperation and development masks more insidious dynamics. Post-colonial partnerships act as a continuation of influence in several ways. The language of development becomes a potent tool employed by Western powers, framing their engagement as benevolent partnerships rather than strategic interventions. This shift in rhetoric, while seemingly supporting the autonomy of African nations, conceals deeper power imbalances and maintains a subtle form of control. The hidden realities lie in the potential discrepancy between the declared intentions of partnership and the actual impact on African nations. Despite the emergence from direct colonial rule, historical legacies persist, creating a complex dynamic where African nations must navigate relationships carefully to protect their autonomy. The continuity of influence is evident in how Western powers strategically shape these partnerships, ensuring their interests are advanced under cooperation. But how is it done? In what ways do economic relationships and trade agreements between African nations and Western powers harbor imbalances that favor the West's interests? Economic relationships and trade agreements between African nations and Western powers often harbor imbalances that tilt in favor of the West, exacerbating economic disparities on the continent. Despite the shift from overt exploitation to a narrative of cooperation, these arrangements may perpetuate historical patterns of inequality. One prominent way is through asymmetrical trade deals, where terms and conditions are structured to benefit Western interests, leaving African nations vulnerable. Resource extraction, a familiar aspect of colonial history, resurfaces in modern times as a manifestation of these imbalances. The exploitation of Africa's rich resources raises environmental and socio-economic concerns. Foreign entities capitalize on the continent's wealth, continuing a historical trend where economic gains disproportionately flow toward Western powers. And how does the exploitation of Africa's resources, reminiscent of colonial history, raise environmental and socio-economic concerns in modern times? The exploitation of Africa's resources in modern times, reminiscent of colonial history, raises significant environmental and socio-economic concerns. This exploitation involves foreign entities capitalizing on the continent's abundant wealth, mirroring historical patterns of resource extraction. The consequences of this contemporary resource exploitation extend beyond mere economic considerations. From an environmental standpoint, extracting Africa's rich resources can lead to ecological and environmental degradation. The indiscriminate exploitation of natural resources often results in deforestation, soil erosion, and pollution, impacting local ecosystems and biodiversity. Additionally, extractive industries may employ practices that disregard environmental sustainability, further exacerbating the ecological footprint of resource extraction. Socioeconomic concerns arise as the benefits of resource exploitation may not be equitably distributed among the local populations. Economic imbalances reminiscent of colonial-era practices persist in modern resource agreements. Local communities may not reap the full benefits of resource wealth, contributing to social disparities and potentially exacerbating existing inequalities. Moreover, the extraction activities may disrupt traditional livelihoods, leading to socioeconomic instability in affected regions. Is political influence the reason behind all this? What role does political influence play in neo-colonial dynamics, and how do partnerships subtly shape African political decisions? Political influence plays a role in neo-colonial dynamics, where partnerships between African nations and Western powers can subtly shape political decisions on the continent. Partnerships often become a vehicle through which external interests influence African political decisions, potentially diverting them from the nation's priorities. One key mechanism through which this influence operates is conditional aid. Partnerships involve economic assistance with strings attached, creating a delicate balance between financial support and compromising national autonomy. Conditions imposed on aid packages lead to situations where African nations make political decisions that align more closely with the interests of the external partners rather than their sovereign priorities. The subtlety of political influence within partnerships can also be observed in diplomatic tricks. Through their engagement, Western powers may influence the formulation of foreign policies in African nations, shaping them to align with external interests. The challenge for African nations lies in maintaining a delicate balance between leveraging partnerships for development and safeguarding their political autonomy. How does conditional aid, a cornerstone of partnerships, impact the autonomy of African nations? Conditional aid, a cornerstone of partnerships between African nations and Western powers, significantly impacts African nations' autonomy and poses challenges to independent decision-making.
Okay, and Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that.
One primary way conditional aid affects autonomy is by placing constraints on the recipient nations. In accepting financial assistance, African nations may find themselves bound by specific conditions set by their Western partners. These conditions could range from economic reforms to alignment with particular foreign policies, influencing the decision-making process of the recipient nations. Consequently, the autonomy to make independent choices based on national interests also gets compromised. The challenges posed to independent decision-making arise from the potential conflict between the conditions imposed and the sovereign priorities of African nations. The need for financial support compels nations to comply with external demands, even if they counter the nation's best interests. This creates a complex dilemma, where the economic assistance provided through partnerships may come at the cost of compromising the ability of African nations to make decisions that genuinely reflect their priorities. But as we have discussed, multinational corporations also play a part in colonialism. So, let's talk in detail about the role of multinational corporations in perpetuating neo-colonial relations and how they influence African economies. Multinational corporations play a crucial role in perpetuating neo-colonial relations and significantly influence African economies. Their impact highlights the complexities of contemporary partnerships and raises questions about accountability and ethical business practices. The influence of Western corporations in African economies is multifaceted. On one hand, these corporations contribute to economic growth by driving investment, creating job opportunities, and facilitating technology transfer. However, the darker side of this influence is seen in how these corporations can perpetuate exploitation reminiscent of colonial history. Their pursuit of profit may lead to resource extraction without adequate consideration for environmental sustainability or fair labor practices. Additionally, the economic power wielded by multinational corporations can result in imbalances within African nations. While contributing to economic growth, these corporations also perpetuate exploitation, leading to questions about fair wealth distribution and the equitable sharing of benefits. The capital and resources flowing through these corporations often follow paths that do not align with the African nation's broader interests and development priorities. The role of multinational corporations in perpetuating neo-colonial relations is evident in their ability to shape economic policies and practices within African countries. Their unchecked influence can lead to scenarios where economic decisions are driven more by the interests of these corporations than by the well-being of the local populations. Does Africa know it is being colonized? It's important to recognize that Africa is not a monolithic entity. It consists of 54 diverse countries, each with a unique history, governance structures, and socioeconomic conditions. Therefore, opinions and awareness regarding the nature of partnerships with Western countries vary widely across the continent. Many African nations have a growing awareness and scrutiny of international partnerships, especially those with former colonial powers or other influential Western nations. Civil society, academics, and some political leaders often engage in discussions and critiques regarding the terms and implications of these partnerships. Concerns about economic imbalances, resource exploitation, and potential neo-colonial dynamics are often raised. While some Africans see certain partnerships as beneficial for economic development, others are skeptical about hidden motives and power imbalances. The awareness of neo-colonial tendencies, where external actors exert influence under the guise of collaboration, is a topic of ongoing discourse and debate in many African countries. Are African nations doing anything in this regard? Many African nations are actively taking steps to assert their sovereignty, foster equitable partnerships, and mitigate the potential exploitation or neo-colonial dynamics in relationships with Western nations. African countries are increasingly diversifying their diplomatic and economic partnerships. Instead of relying solely on Western nations, many engage with a broader range of countries, including emerging economies and regional allies. This diversification helps reduce dependency on a single source of support and strengthens negotiating positions. Some African nations are implementing policy reforms to ensure transparency, accountability, and fairness in their dealings with external actors. This includes creating and enforcing regulations that protect national interests, prevent corruption, and foster sustainable development. Some countries are implementing more transparent and responsible resource management practices. This involves renegotiating resource extraction contracts to ensure that benefits are shared more equitably. Environmental sustainability is considered, and local communities benefit from these resources. African nations are increasingly advocating for fair trade practices in international economic agreements. This includes pushing for more balanced trade deals that prioritize mutual benefit and prevent the exploitation of economic imbalances. Education, technology, and infrastructure investments empower African nations to negotiate more equally. Strengthening institutional capabilities enhances their ability to navigate complex international agreements and collaborations. African nations are working towards greater regional integration, forming alliances such as the African Union (AU) to present a unified front in negotiations. Collective bargaining and coordinated policies enhance the continent's ability to resist unfavorable terms and conditions. Civil society organizations, advocacy groups, and the general public are crucial in holding governments accountable and advocating for fair and just partnerships. Increased awareness and activism contribute to shaping public opinion and influencing policy decisions. After knowing all this, is there a growing call for genuine collaboration in Africa? And what specific changes are advocates emphasizing to empower African voices? The growing call for genuine collaboration in Africa stems from concerns about persisting challenges associated with neo-colonial dynamics and the need to empower African voices in their relationships with Western powers. Advocates emphasize specific changes to foster a more inclusive and equitable partnership approach. The call for genuine collaboration arises from recognizing historical imbalances in contemporary partnerships. Despite the narrative of cooperation and development, there is a need to ensure that these relationships authentically contribute to Africa's development rather than perpetuate historical power imbalances. Advocates stress the importance of dismantling remnants of neo-colonialism, allowing African nations to reclaim agency in their relationships and decision-making processes. Advocates emphasize the need for a more inclusive decision-making process to empower African voices. This involves ensuring that African nations have a meaningful role in shaping the terms of partnerships, and that their priorities are given due consideration. Transparent agreements in trade and resource partnerships are deemed essential, promoting mutual benefit and preventing asymmetrical power dynamics. By urging clarity and fairness, advocates aim to shift the narrative from mere cooperation to genuine collaboration, where African nations actively participate in decisions that impact their development. But can the West do partnership without exploitation? And how can that be ensured? Transparent agreements in trade and resource partnerships can play a crucial role in fostering mutual benefit between African nations and Western powers. The transparency of these agreements addresses key issues outlined in the article, contributing to a more equitable and genuinely collaborative relationship. Firstly, transparency ensures that the terms and conditions of trade and resource partnerships are clear and accessible to all parties involved. This clarity helps mitigate the potential for hidden imbalances and prevents the exploitation of ambiguity that may have characterized historical agreements. With a shared understanding of the terms, African nations and Western powers can enter into partnerships with greater confidence and trust. Secondly, transparent agreements promote fairness by clearly outlining the benefits and risks associated with trade and resource exploitation. This clarity facilitates a more balanced distribution of economic gains, preventing scenarios where one party disproportionately benefits at the expense of the other. Fairness in these agreements contributes to African nations' overall development and well-being. Furthermore, transparency fosters accountability and ethical business practices. When the terms of partnerships are open to scrutiny, African nations and Western corporations can be held accountable for their actions. This accountability is crucial in preventing exploitative practices, environmental degradation, and other negative consequences that might arise from opaque agreements. What steps are necessary for Africa to reclaim agency in its relationships and ensure that partnerships genuinely contribute to its development? Several essential steps need to be taken for Africa to reclaim agency in its relationships and ensure that partnerships genuinely contribute to its development. These steps focus on empowering African nations, fostering transparency, and reshaping the dynamics of collaboration. African nations should actively participate in decision-making processes related to partnerships. Ensuring inclusivity allows them to have a meaningful role in shaping the terms and conditions of agreements. This involvement safeguards their interests and priorities, promoting a more balanced and mutually beneficial relationship. Transparency is paramount. Clear and accessible terms in trade and resource partnerships prevent hidden imbalances and promote a shared understanding of expectations. Transparent agreements build trust between African nations and Western powers, reducing the likelihood of exploitation and misunderstandings. Agreements should prioritize the fair distribution of economic benefits. Ensuring that both parties share the advantages and risks of partnerships helps prevent one side from disproportionately benefiting at the expense of the other. Fairness contributes to the overall development and well-being of African nations. Establishing mechanisms for accountability and ethical business practices is crucial. Holding African nations and Western corporations accountable for their actions ensures that agreements are implemented responsibly, preventing exploitation, environmental degradation, and other negative consequences. Empowering African nations through investment in education, technology, and infrastructure is vital. This builds the capacity to negotiate and engage on an equal footing in partnerships. Strengthening institutional capabilities enhances the ability of African nations to navigate collaborations more effectively. Advocacy for policy reforms at both national and international levels is essential. This involves pushing for regulatory frameworks that protect the interests of African nations and promote sustainable and equitable development. Actively seeking diverse partnerships beyond traditional Western powers can reduce dependence and give African nations more leverage. Exploring collaborations with emerging economies and regional alliances contributes to a more balanced and diversified engagement. Do you think the West can ever give up its habit of exploiting Africa? Why is their hunger not yet fulfilled? Will the African nations with new leaders allow this to happen? Let us know in the comments section what you would suggest if you were asked to give a solution to this continued colonialism. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
Deposit Photos Music.